Okay, tonight we're going to talk about conservation. We've heard a lot about capitalist greed, in quotes, ravaging our natural resources and destroying it, sort of like a mighty blight coming over the land. There are many areas where capitalist greed is supposed to ravage our resources. The main one for many years used to be the forests, and we'll get to that in a minute. First question to ask about this point about capitalist greed ravaging our resources is how come it hasn't ravaged a lot of other stuff? I mean, how come it's ravaged, say, the forest and various other specific items, such as the fisheries, salmon, and the cod, and the whale, etc. So how come it's ravaged these things, but it has not ravaged copper and iron and various other natural resources, which are still holding up fairly well? So the question then is, well, since capitalist greed is supposedly no more greedy in the case of the forest, say, than it is in the case of copper and iron and whatever, how come the capitalist greed has done its evil work in those areas and not in the second areas? There must be something about the areas themselves that's the problem, and not alleged capitalist greed. First of all, about the forests, which I may as well just mention passing. True, there's a lot less forest now than there was in 1492 when Columbus landed. In those days, the whole country, the whole land was covered with forests, and the problem then is, if you really want to preserve the forest primeval state in which it was in 1490, we'd be in pretty bad shape. As a matter of fact, we wouldn't be here at all, because the only way in which we could land and clear and establish houses and factories and roads and all that sort of stuff was to get rid of the forests. The basic problem here, that the forests are occupying this land, which turned out to be more valuable for other things, for other uses, and so we had to chop down the forest. And if the Sierra Club had been around in 1492, we never have gotten off the boat. So you have the basic problem with the conservationists that if they want to preserve everything, it's a darn good thing they didn't start a long time ago. Okay, but obviously if you want to preserve the entire forest of the continent, it's either that or us. It's either the trees or mankind has to survive. Okay, so what is there, before we get back to the forest and the allied problems, what is there in the market that prevents ravaging, total destruction of copper and iron and all these other natural resources? What happens is that the free market has a built-in mechanism, if I can use the word mechanism. There's a built-in mechanism which provides what we can call optimal conservation, which provides a situation where business firms in the market produce a certain optimal amount per year and leave the rest of it, also an optimal amount, on the ground. Put it this way. Supposing we have a mine, it could be a copper mine or whatever, and the mine has, say, $100 million worth in the ground. The mine owner, say the copper mine owner, is faced with a choice. How much should he dig out this year? How much should he leave? Well, if he digs out $10 million this year, okay, let's say he gets a certain profit on that, but then he's got $90 million worth of copper left. If, on the other hand, he digs out $20 million, then he's got $80 million left. Now, this illustrates the point that if he increases his annual production, in other words, if he steps up his current rate of production, he will get higher profits, let's say, this year. However, he is then left with a problem. He has $20 million less capital value than he had before. So, in other words, he always has to choose. On the market, he's faced with a constant series of choices, and one of these series of choices is between annual production, revving up your current income, but then having a lower capital value. And a lower capital value means that if he wants to sell either the mine itself or the shares of stock in the mine, he's going to have to accept a lower price because then the capital value declines. So these are two things he always has to guard against. So in other words, he's not going to just shoot the whole $100 million this year, because if he does that, his capital value of what he has remaining goes down to zero. So the corrective mechanism, or part of the corrective mechanism we can see right away in the market, even though he wants current profits, he doesn't want to lose the present capital value of his future profits. In other words, the mine as a whole, since he owns the copper mine as a whole, he owns shares in the copper mine as a whole, the value of that copper mine as a whole is a discount of future returns, so these future returns are brought back by the market into the current capital value. Basically, choice depends on several things. Suppose he expects the price to rise of copper in the fairly near future. Say he expects there's going to be a big copper shortage next year or 2 years from now. So as he's concerned, the expected capital value is increased. He expects the price of copper to go up in the near future, and then because the capital value is now greater in relation to the current price, he will then hold back copper. It's very similar to the wheat speculator who expects the price of wheat, say, to go up in 6 months. He holds on to the wheat now. This raises the price of wheat now from what it would have been, but then later on, when the price does go up of wheat, he dumps his wheat, takes the profit, and by doing that, lowers the price in 6 months. So this means the speculator, first of all, he smooths out fluctuations in prices on the market, and second of all, he shifts the supply from where it's less valued by the consumer, say today, to where it's more valued by the consumer, say in 6 months when the shortage of wheat arises, or there's less wheat. Same way with copper. The fact that he has this capital value mechanism leads him to hold back copper now when the price is cheaper and therefore not as valued by the consumer, and then sell it 2 years from now, 3 years from now, when the copper shortage emerges, and therefore it's more valued by the consumer and the price is higher, and he sells it. This is part of the way the free market mechanism shifts resources from where they're less valued to where they're more valued by the consumer, in this case, from the present to the future, thereby benefiting the consumers as a whole by shifting the production of copper from now to 3 years from now. On the other hand, supposing he expects that in 2 or 3 years there'll be a new substitute for copper, some big new alloy will come up or something like that, or some new technological development which will make copper more or less obsolete, which will outcompete copper. In that case, he expects the price of copper to fall. His estimate of the capital value will decline. He will therefore step up his current production and deplete his capital value because it's after all going down anyway, and thereby shift from future production to present production. Again, benefiting the consumers, because what's the point of producing copper in 20 years when there's a new substitute? It'll be almost worthless. Better produce it now. And this market mechanism provides the incentive to do that. He gets the signal from the market, so to speak. Capital value is going down. We expect there's going to be a future obsolescence of copper. Therefore, let's produce it now when the profits are greater. So, expected changes in the price are a key thing, which reflect on the capital value and give the signal to the producer, or the mine owner, the natural resource owner, to produce either more or less now, or less or more in the future. Another point is time preference. The higher the rate of interest, the rate of returns are discounted. In other words, the lower the capital value of the mine, the lower the rate of interest, the higher the capital value of the mine. This means that the higher the rate of interest, the more the mine owner will be induced to produce now rather than later. And the lower the rate of interest, the more he'll be induced to save up now and produce and mine the copper later. The rate of interest is a reflection of time preferences of consumers. If the rate of time preference goes up, in other words, if consumers decide they'd like to consume now rather than later, they want to shift their allocation, consume more now and less saving and investment for later, then the rate of interest will go up, and this will be reflected in the lower capital value of the mine, and then this will induce the copper mine owners to produce more now, let the capital value go down further, and produce less in the future. If, on the other hand, the time preference falls, consumers decide they'd like to consume less now and more proportionately later and save and invest more for the future, then the rate of interest will fall, capital value of the mine will go up, mine owners will hold back more production now, will cut down their current production and shift toward future production. They'll invest, in other words, more in the copper mine. The free market has a smooth and rapid reflection, provides rapid reflection of consumer wishes, consumer desires here, because if changes are expected to be either from the supply side or the demand side. In other words, if from the supply side there's going to be a big shortage, a couple of years of copper, this will be reflected in the higher capital value now. The copper mine owner will hold on to more of the copper and produce less of it now. Or if there's going to be a greater supply later on, the copper mine owner will produce more now and less later. Similarly, consumer time preferences are reflected in the rate of interest. In other words, the changes in the demand side by consumers are reflected in the capital value also. So the capital value mechanism, the fact that the mine owner owns the mine itself, owns the natural resource itself, means that he can then allocate his current production versus his future production. Okay, let's go to another point about copper miner. Supposing the supply of copper does dwindle. We're forgetting now exactly about the present versus the future. Supply of copper gets short. The price of copper, therefore, goes up. Now, what happens in this situation when the price of copper goes up? The rise in copper, the price of copper itself, provides another built-in mechanism. In the first place, the fact that the price of copper goes up means the consumers, they'll start buying less copper. Either they'll produce less, or whatever is used in copper, and they'll go into some other business, or they'll shift from copper to some other substitute metal. So in other words, each individual buyer, on the basis of his value scales and income, etc., will voluntarily ration his own purchases. Especially the marginal buyers who really just don't really want that much copper anyway. They could easily shift to aluminum or some other metal. The really gung-ho copper buyers will still buy more or less the same amount. So we have then a rationing system which is smooth and voluntary, and where each individual decides on his own belt-tightening. In contrast, of course, the government rationing system where a meat axe approach is used and everybody's got to suffer equally or suffer together. Suffer, of course, a lot more. Secondly, the rise in the copper price will then stimulate a greater search for supply. So the price of copper is now higher, people start going around with their whatever the Geiger counter equivalent is in the copper business, and start looking for more copper. So now it'd be more worthwhile to start finding it and using it. There's a lot of minerals down underneath the ground, an enormous number of minerals which haven't been discovered yet. For example, a natural gas caper. Everybody knows there's an enormous amount of natural gas. They haven't been found yet because it hasn't been worthwhile if anybody go out and look for it for about 20 years, because the price of natural gas has been held down about 25 cents per 1,000 cubic feet when the free market price is somewhere between 55 cents and $1. But on the other hand, if the price goes up of copper, the higher the price will be, and the greater the incentive to go out there with your copper Geiger counters or whatever and try to find more copper. And more copper will inevitably be found, by the way. Supply will eventually increase and the price will then fall. And third of all, the rise in the price of copper will stimulate substitutes, will stimulate people to start using substitutes, so whatever other metal will be used, or to try to invest in technologies which will discover substitutes, because technology follows the market in most cases. Nobody's going to start looking around for copper substitutes very much, with a great deal of enthusiasm, and invest resources in it, unless there's a big copper scarcity, and the price of copper is high, and then you start looking around for all sorts of ways of getting around it and something which will perform the same function as copper. It's the same way with this energy caper now. So there's lots of energy sources around, solar energy and nuclear and shale oil and the tropical oceans and all sorts of other stuff. It just has been too uneconomic to even look around and try to invest in the technology for these things. If the price of energy is ever allowed to go up to its free market level, then these other sources will start to be economic to start investigating these sources and start trying to exploit them and use them, and then they will start pouring on the market in a few years. If not, of course, if the price of energy remains at the current price control level, there's no incentive to go out there and invest in the new technology. Okay, so where the free market can operate, where private property rights and the free market are allowed to operate, we have these built-in mechanisms in the market which, one, eliminate any problem of ravaging of all, suddenly you wake up tomorrow morning, all the copper is gone. It doesn't work that way. And if there is an increased scarcity of copper, there are mechanisms that work to voluntarily ration and to also induce greater supply. So all of these things are at work. How come then the forests were ravaged, and how come the fish in the ocean were ravaged, et cetera, et cetera? How come there are these areas where it seems that the market didn't work successfully? It seems that there was overproduction or overuse or depletion. Before I get to that, just one more point about technology and resource and market and resources. We think of the Industrial Revolution and technology as using up a lot of resources. Gas guzzling, as the current term is, and so forth, in all these various areas. Actually, technology often creates a lot of resources, which weren't resources before technology or industry came on the scene. For example, petroleum, which we're now a lot of bellyaching about is going on, petroleum wasn't a resource until the Industrial Revolution. Before, in other words, the advent of automobiles, and also kerosene lamps, let's say, but basically before the advent of automobiles, petroleum was just a pain in the neck. It was just a black ooze. It was a complete waste. I mean, it wasn't used for anything. It was just yuck. And it was only the development of automobiles and petroleum technology that created a resource out of something which was just a pain in the neck before. And this has been done with lots of other things, with slag and lots of other technological things which I'm not even familiar with. Okay, so what about these cases of ravaging? What about these cases of depletion and so forth? What's been happening there? How come? What happened there and how come is very simple, and I will just go from one case to the next, elaborating on the basic point. The basic point is there ain't no shortage ever, or depletion or ravaging, unless the government sets up the thing in such a way as not to allow private property rights to function. Instead of it being capitalist greed that's at fault, the fault is that capitalist greed hasn't been allowed to operate enough. In other words, the government has come in to restrict private property and capitalist greed, in quotes, from performing its function, the sort of function we've been talking about. The major problem has come about in those cases where the government has not allowed private property to function in the resource itself, but has allowed private property in the use of the resource. For example, the government says no private property is permissible in a copper mine itself. Nobody's allowed this. It's evil and immoral for the private individuals to own copper mine. However, you can take as much copper out of the ground as you want to. And then you own that. But you can't own the copper mine itself, actually the resource itself. Well, what's going to happen? This can be done either one of two ways. Either the government can declare what we can call copper communism. In other words, the mine itself will be used by the first guy who comes there and starts digging it up. That's one way of doing it. Or the other way, the government can own the copper mine and lease it out to whoever it wants to lease it to. First function, the copper communism, first the system, so to speak, sets up a situation where If I don't go in there and mine